You know, a fierce debate across the country this week over the Confederate flag and its racist connotation. South Carolina's governor is urging lawmakers to remove the flag from the Capitol grounds after the murders of 9 black people in a historic black church last week. It is not just South Carolina. Other states now, Alabama, Mississippi, Virginia, have taken up the question of the Confederate symbol on flags and license plates. Major retailers, Walmart, Sears, are refusing to carry merchandise with the Confederate flag. Is it time for the flag to come down? And even here in Michigan, flag retailers are now not restocking Confederate flags because they can't get them now from the manufacturers. This has really changed the conversation in the last week, and I'm not sure that after the shooting in Charleston, if this is what I anticipated would happen a week later, that this is what the big conversation coming out of that shooting would be.
A lot easier than having a conversation about what's
going
on, what the real issue is. But
yeah.
you know, my problem with this is, and I believe the Confederate flag shouldn't fly over public buildings, south, north, or anywhere. I mean, it's offensive to a good piece of the population, and governments shouldn't willfully do that. And it was a symbol of rebellion, which, you know, the South lost that war. But my issue is, once again, you've got folks saying, you know, piling on here, pretending all of the racism, all of our racism problem is in the South, and it's all embodied in a few symbols. I mean, that's very easy, but it's fairly typical stereotyping of the South. And you know, you might ask, well, why do they cling to these symbols of Southern pride? I think a lot of it has to do, they just want to say, you know, shove it to the rest of the country who are constantly, you know, painting them up as if it was still 1960 down there.
So what do you think the conversation really should be about then?
Well, I mean, this idea that, gosh, we should have a conversation about race as if we haven't been talking about it for 60 years puzzles me. I mean, we need to, if we're going to say, let's have a conversation about race.
Well, maybe we're not having the right conversation about race. We're still talking about it for 60 years.
Then what should that conversation look like?
Well, it's got to.
I mean, we talk.
It's got to
focus.
We
probably should start doing something.
Well, it's just got to focus on inequality. That's the problem, right? Mm-hmm. There is still.
And we haven't been talking about that.
There are still many drivers of inequality in this country that have to do with race, which is not what the law says it should be, and it's not morally right. And so for starters, when you fly a flag like the Confederate flag over a government building in South Carolina, you are giving state sponsorship to that rebellion, that insurrection, and to the idea of slavery, which is what the war was about. You go back. I went back this week and read what South Carolina said, what the South Carolina legislature said when it fired on Fort Sumter. Slavery is right up there.
And I would say South Carolina's made more progress in the last 50 years than Michigan has.
I'm not sure I would say that.
And yet, you know,
why would you say that?
Well, because they've been forced to deal with their segregation issues, and I don't think we ever have here.
They still had the debate about the Confederate flag, though, for years.
It's about inequality. If you are an African American,
that the Confederate flag is the only problem here. Again, my point again is you're avoiding the real issue.
Poverty and lack of opportunity are so much more intense for African Americans in South Carolina than they are in states like Michigan.
Michigan's headed that way,
and you can't divorce that inequality from its history. That's not by accident. It's not just by circumstance. It's by design.
In the regions, Steve.
Of course, it's not isolated.
I mean, we were loading up buses in Detroit and sending them down to fix the South's problem when we were the most segregated region in the nation. Same thing in Boston.
Nobody gets a pass.
And well,
no one's saying that.
The smugness of this current debate that, oh gosh, it's those folks down south again, I think is stereotyping a region of the country.
They're flying the flag that symbolizes that inequality over government buildings in not just South Carolina,
when that flag comes
but
down,
other places.
The issues are going to still be there. They're going to be there in South Carolina. They're going to be there in Michigan. Had that shooting happened in Michigan, you know, it would have been, oh gosh, how terrible and how tragic for the state. And it wouldn't have been, but look how they've lived there for 50 years. We wouldn't have been talking about that.
All right, so this is...
So we're hung up on this symbol rather than, I think, the basic issue.
So this is a national issue then, and you said it's time to stop talking and it's time to start some action.
It's time to stop pretending we don't talk about it. We talk about it, talk about it, talk about it.
We don't do
so
it.
what's the action?
Something like this
what's
happens,
the do something then?
Every time something like this happens, we say, let's have a conversation about race, as if we're not.
But
we always are.
It's not about the symbol, it's about the clinging to the symbol and what that means in a state where racial inequality is still part of the very infrastructure that runs the place.
We don't have that flag here, Steve. Could that shooting have happened in Michigan?
Of course it could. Of course it could. When it happens,
we wouldn't have attached it to our history here, and I think that's
because we don't have the same history as South Carolina.
We have a racist history in this state.
We have a racist history in this country, but the South decided at some point that it was going to leave the Union to preserve.
150 years ago, Steve. The war ended 150 years ago.
40 and 50 years ago. People like my father, born in Mississippi in 1933, were prevented from voting in the South. That's in my life. It's just barely outside of my lifetime. And you're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about recent history in which certain states have been more pernicious about enforcing that racial inequality. And South Carolina is one of them.
Over the last 50 years, they've made more progress in the South than they have in other regions of the country. You have two minority governors in the country, both of them in the South, including one in South Carolina.
All right, so, okay, I'm going to get back to the question then. What happens next? What's the action? So now we have this national conversation that's come out of something very tragic, and it feels like we do have these conversations that come out of things. So now what's the next step?
I would agree with Steve. You got to start addressing the issues of inequality. You got to start fixing the schools. I mean, we can't continue to have so much of the black population trapped in schools that fail, and those are black people and white people who are trapping these kids there. So I mean, you've got to start with figuring out how we're going to give people the skills and the ambition and the hope they need to get out of poverty themselves. If all we're going to do is say, well, we're not going to educate you, we're not going to give you any skills, we're just going to write you a check, you just keep living like that, I think it's the wrong approach.
But it does start with a reckoning of that history. And one of the things that's been most disturbing in South Carolina over the last week is to watch members of its legislature, its U.S. senator, its governor apologize for the behavior that enforces this inequality and badly misunderstand their own histories and their own roles in that history.
I mean, this perpetual...
You can't get to this
perpetual punishment of
punishment.
the South is I
think it's punishment.
I think it's very convenient for the folks who live outside the South to say, that's all their problem, not our problem.
I think they have a problem that they need to reckon.
Take a look at the way children are living in Detroit and the opportunities black children have in Detroit.
No question.
I'd say it's
not
not
acceptable.
Lot worse than
it's
it
not
is in
acceptable.
Charleston.